See if that goes. Come on, YouTube. Maybe we'll go. Maybe the baby will go. Maybe the baby will go. Come on, YouTube. There it goes. There it goes. All right, then. Oh my gosh, it even went live on my thing and it has the thumbnail going. Oh, I love my thumbnail still. I think it's a good thumbnail. All right, though. I'm probably going to be moving around a lot, trying to find a comfortable spot, but we'll deal with it. All right, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, Chapter 5, Riddles in the Dark. So, where we last left off, he fell. There was a big fight with the goblins. They killed the Goblin King, and then Bilbo fell down a hole. So we're going to see what happens next. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark with them shut. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine this fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and he could almost feel nothing except the stone of the floor. Very slowly he got up and groped on about all fours till he touched the wall of the tunnel, but neither up nor down it could he find anything, nothing at all. No signs of goblins, no signs of dwarves. His head was spinning, and he was far from certain even of the direction they had been going in when he had his fall. He guessed as well as he could, and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hands met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket without thinking. Certainly it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long time. He thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that it was high time for some meal or other. But that only made him miserabler. Miserabler, JR? Come on. You're the boss. He could not think what to do, nor could he think what had happened, or why he'd been left behind, or why if he had been left behind, the goblins had not caught him, or even why his head was so sore. The truth was, he had been lying quiet, out of sight and out of mind, in a very dark corner for a long while. After some time, he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, and there was something. It was not broken, and that was something. Then he felt for his pouch, and there was some tobacco in it, and that was something more. Then he felt for matches, and he could not find any at all, and that shattered his hopes completely. Just as well for him as he agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of matches and the smell of tobacco would have brought him out of dark holes in that horrible place. Still at the moment he felt very crushed. But in slapping all of his pockets and feeling all round himself for matches in his hands came the hilt of his little sword, the little dagger that he got from the trolls, that he had quite forgotten, nor fortunately had the goblins noticed it, as he wore it inside his breeches. Now he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it's an elvish blade too? He thought, and goblins are not very near, and yet not far enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made of gondoloin for the goblin wars of which so many songs had sung. And also he had noticed that such weapons made a great impression on goblins that came upon them suddenly. Go back, he thought. Not good at all. Go sideways? Impossible. Go forward? Only thing to do. On we go. So up he got, and trotted along, his little sword held in front of him, and he had one hand feeling the wall, and his heart of all a patter and a pitter. Now certainly Bilbo was in what is called a tight place, but you must remember, it was not quite so tight for him as that it would have been for me or you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people, and after all, if their holes are nice, cheery places, and properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of the goblins. Still, they are more used to tunneling than we are, and they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground. Not when their heads have recovered from being bumped. Also, they can move very quietly and hide easily, and recover fully from falls and bruises. And they have found a fund of wisdom and wise sayings that men mostly never heard or have forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins' place all the time. All the same. The tunnel seemed to have no end. All he knew that it was still going down pretty steadily, and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist and a turn or two. There were passages leading off to the side every now and then, as he knew by the glimmer of his sword, or could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these he took no notice, except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On and on he went, and down, and still he heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat and by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop, on, until he was tireder than tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow and over it to the days beyond. Whew. Suddenly, without any warning, he trotted splash into water. Ugh! It was icy cold. That pulled him sharp and short. He did not know whether it was just a pool in the path or an edge of an underground stream that crossed the passage, or the brink of a deep, dark subterranean lake. The sword was hardly shining at all. He stopped, and he could hear, when he listened hard, drops dripping from an unseen roof into the water below, but there seemed no sort of sound. So is it a pool or a lake, and not? So it is a pool or a lake, and not an underground river, he thought. Still, he did not dare to wade out into the darkness. He could not swim, and he thought, too, of nasty, slimy things with big, bulging, blind eyes, wriggling in the water. There are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of mountains, fish whose fathers swam in, goodness only knows how many years ago, and never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. Also, there were other things more slimy than fish. Oh boy, we're only 3 pages in. In my throat. Even in the tunnels and caves the goblins have made for themselves, there are other things living unbeknown to them that have sneaked in from outside to lie up in the dark. Some of these caves go too back in their beginning to ages before the goblins, who only widened them and joined them up in the passages, and the original owners are still there in odd corners, sinking and nosing about. Deep down there, by the dark water, lived an old golem, a small, slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. He was a golem, as dark as darkness, except for 2 big, round, pale eyes in his thin face. He had a little boat, and he rowed about quite quietly on the lake, for lake it was, wide and deep and deadly cold. He paddled it with large feet dangling over the side, but never ripple did he make, not he. He was looking out for his pale, lamp-like eyes for blind fish, which he grabbed with his long fingers as quick as thinking. He liked meat, too. Goblin, he thought, good, when he could get it. But he took care they never found him out. He just throttled them from behind, if they ever came down alone anywhere near the edge of the water while he was prowling about. They very seldom did, for they had a feeling that something unpleasant was lurking down there, down at the very roots of the mountain. They had come on the lake when they were tunneling down long ago, and they found they could go no further. So their road ended in that direction. And there was no reason to go that way unless the great goblin sent them. Sometimes he took a fancy for fish from the lake, and sometimes neither goblin nor fish came back. Actually, Gollum lived on the slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo now from the distance with his pale eyes like telescopes. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see that he was no goblin at all. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island while Bilbo was sitting on the brink, altogether fluxumed at the end of his way in his wits. Suddenly up came Gollum and whispered and hissed.
Bless us and splash us, my precious. I guess it's a choice feast, as least as a tasty morsel, and make us Gollum.
And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. That is how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. The hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came out of his ears, and he suddenly saw the pale eye sticking out of him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger out in front of him.
What is he, my precious?
Whispered Gollum, who always spoke to himself, though never having anyone else to speak to. This is what he had come to find out, for he was not really very hungry at the moment, only curious. Otherwise, he would have grabbed first and whispered afterwards. "I am Mr. Bilbo Baggins. I have lost the dwarves, and I've lost the wizard, and I don't know where I am, and I don't want to know, only if I can get away."
What's he got in his hands?
Said Gollum, looking at the sword, which he did not quite like. A sword, a blade, which came out of Gondloin.
"Sss,"
said Gollum, and he became quite polite.
P'raps we sits here and chats it with it a bitsy, my precious. It likes riddles? P'raps it does it?
He was anxious to appear friendly, at any rate for the moment, and until he found out more about the sword and the hobbit, whether he was quite alone really, whether he was good to eat, and whether Gollum was really hungry. Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them, and sometimes guessing them, had been the only game he had ever played with other funny creatures sitting in their holes in the long, long ago, before he lost all of his friends and was driven away, alone, and crept down into the dark, under the mountains. What you making those faces for, Ralphie? Where was I? Very well, said Bilbo, who was anxious to agree, until he found out more about the creature, whether he was quite alone, whether he was fierce or hungry, and whether he was a friend of the goblins. You ask first, he said. He had not had time to think of a riddle, so Gollum hissed.
What has roots as nobody sees? It's taller than trees. Up it goes, and yet it never grows.
Easy, said Bilbo. Mountains, I suppose.
Does it guess easy? It must have a competition with us, my precious. If Precious asks and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my precious. If it asks us and we don't answer, then we does what it wants, eh? We show it the way out, yes?
All right, said Bilbo, not daring to disagree, and nearly bursting his brain to think of riddles that could save him from being eaten. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. That was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating was rather on his mind. It was rather an old one, too, and Gollum knew the answer as well as you do.
Chestnuts, he hissed. Teeth, my precious. But we has only 6.
Then he asked the second.
Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters.
Half a moment, cried Bilbo, who was still thinking uncomfortably about eating. Fortunately, he had once heard something rather like this before, and getting his wits back, he thought of the answer. Wind, of course, he said, and he was so pleased that he made up one on the spot. This'll puzzle the nasty little underground creature, he thought. Shut up, Ralphie. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye. but in low place, not in high place. Man, I don't know any of these. I couldn't tell you this. Said Gollum. He had been underground a long, long time, and was forgetting this sort of thing. But just as Bilbo was beginning to hope that the wretch could not be able to answer, Gollum brought up memories of age and ages before, when he lived with his grandmother in a hole by a bank by a river.
My precious, he said. Sun on the daisies, it means, it does.
But these ordinary above ground everyday sort of riddles were tiring him. Also, they reminded him of days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty, and that put him out of temper. What is more, they made him hungry, so this time he tried something a little more difficult and more unpleasant.
It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars, and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter.
Unfortunately for Gollum, Bilbo had heard that sort of thing before, and the answer was all around him anyway. Dark, he said, without even scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. A box without hinges, key or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. Let's see. He asked to gain time until he could think of a really hard one. This, he thought, a dreadfully easy chestnut, though he had not asked it in the usual works. But it proved a nasty poser for Gollum. He hissed to himself, and did he not answer, he muttered and spluttered. After some time, while Bilbo became impatient, "Well, what is it?" he said. "The answer's not a kettle boiling over, as you seem to think from the noise you're making."
Give us chance. Let it give us chance, my precious.
"Well," said Bilbo after giving him a long chance, "what about your guess?" But suddenly Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago, and sitting under the river bank, teaching his grandmother to suck.
Eggs, he hissed. Eggs it is.
Then he asked,
alive, without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking.
He also, in turn, thought this was a dreadfully easy one, because he was always thinking of the answer, but he could not remember anything better at the moment. He was so flustered by the egg question. All the time it was a poser for poor Bilbo, who would never had anything to do with water if he could help it. I imagine you know the answer, of course, or can guess it as easy as winking, since you're sitting comfortably at home and have not the danger of being eaten to disturb your thinking. Bilbo sat and cleared his throat once or twice, but no answer came. After a while, Gollum began to hiss with pleasure to himself.
It is nice, my precious. Is it juicy? Is it scrumptiously crunchable?
He began to peer at Bilbo out of the darkness. "Half a moment," said Bilbo, shivering. "I gave you a good long chance just now."
"It must make haste, haste,"
said Gollum, beginning to climb out of his boat onto the shore to get at Bilbo. But when he put his long, webby foot in the water, a fish jumped out in fright and fell on Bilbo's toes. "Ugh!" he said. "It is cold and clammy." And so he guessed. "Fish! Fish!" he cried. "Fish! It is fish!" Gollum was dreadfully disappointed, but Bilbo asked another riddle as quick as he ever could, so that Gollum had to get back into his boat and think. "No legs lay. No legs lay on one leg. 2 legs sat near on 3 legs. 4 legs got some." It was not really the right time for this riddle, but Bilbo was in a hurry. Gollum might have had some trouble guessing if he had asked it at another time, as it was talking of fish, no legs. But it was not so very difficult, and after that, the rest was easy.
Fish on a little table. Men at the... Fish on a little table, man at the table, sitting on a stool. The cat has the bones.
That, of course, is the answer, and Gollum soon gave it. Fish on a little table, man at the table, sitting on a stool. The cat has the bones. All right. Then he thought the time had come to ask something hard and horrible. This is what he said.
This thing all things devours. Birds, beast, trees, flowers. Gnaws iron, bites steel. Grinds hard stones to meal. Slays kings, ruins towns, and beats the high mountain down.
I think I know this one. Poor Bilbo sat in the dark thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and ogres he had ever heard told of in tales. But not one of them had done all of these things. He had a feeling that the answer was quite different and that he ought to know it. But he could not think of it. He began to get frightened, and that is bad for thinking. Gollum began to get out of his boat. He flapped into the water and paddled to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming towards him. His tongue seemed to stick in his mouth. He wanted to shout out, "Give me more time! Give me time!" But all that came out with a sudden squeal was, "Time! Time!" Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for that, of course, was the answer. Gollum was disappointed once more, and now he was getting angry, and also tired of the game. It had made him very hungry indeed. This time he did not go back to the boat. He sat down in the dark by Bilbo. That made the hobbit most dreadfully uncomfortable and scattered his wits.
It's got to ask us a question, my precious. Yes, yes, yes. Just one more question to guess. Yes, yes, said Gollum.
But Bilbo simply could not think of any question with that nasty wet cold thing sitting next to him and pawing and poking him. He scratched himself. He pinched himself. Still, he could not think of anything. Ask us, said Gollum. Bilbo pinched himself and slapped himself. He gripped on his little sword. He even felt in his pocket with his other hand. There he found the ring he had picked up in the passage and forgotten about. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said aloud. He was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle, and he was frightfully upset.
Not fair, he hissed. It isn't fair, my precious, is it, to ask us what it got in its nasty little pockets?
Bilbo, seeing what had happened, and having nothing better to ask, stuck to his question. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said louder. Hissed Gollum.
"It must give us 3 guesses, my precious, 3 guesses.
"Very well, guess away," said Bilbo.
"Hanses," said Gollum.
"Wrong," said Bilbo, who had luckily taken his hand out again. "Guess again," said Gollum, more upset than ever. He thought of all the things he kept in his own pockets. Fish bones, goblins' teeth, wet shells, a bit of bat wing, a sharp stone to sharpen his fangs on, and other nasty things. He tried to think of what other people kept in their pockets. "Knife," he said at last. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had lost his some time ago. "Last guess." Now Gollum was in a much worse state than when Bilbo had asked him the egg question. He hissed and spluttered and rocked himself backwards and forwards and slapped his feet on the floor and wriggled and squirmed. But still, he did not dare to waste his last guess. "Come on," Bilbo said. "I'm waiting." He tried to sound bold and cheerful, but he did not feel all sure how the game was going to end, whether Gollum guessed right or not. "Time's up," he said. "String! Or nothing!" shrieked Gollum, which was not quite fair, working in 2 guesses at once. "Both wrong," cried Bilbo, very much relieved, and he jumped at once to his feet. put his back to the nearest wall, and held out his little sword. He knew, of course, that the riddle game was scared of and was sacred and of immense antiquity, and even wicked creatures were afraid to cheat when they played at it. But he felt he could not trust this slimy thing to keep any promise in a pinch. Any excuse would do for him to slide out of it. And after all, that last question had not been a genuine riddle according to the ancient laws. But at any rate, Gollum did not at once attack him. He could see the sword in Bilbo's hand. He sat still, shivering and whimpering. At last, Bilbo could wait no longer. "Well," he said, "what about your promise? I want to go. You must show me the way."
"Did we say so, precious? Show the nasty little Baggins the way out? Yes, yes. But what has it got in its pockets? Eh? Not string, precious, but not nothing. Oh, no."
"Never you mind. A promise is a promise."
"Cross it is, impatient, precious," hissed Gollum. "But it must wait. Yes, it must. We can't go up in the tunnel so hasty. We must go and get some things first. Yes, things to help us."
"Well, hurry up," said Bilbo, relieved to think of Gollum going away. He thought he was just making an excuse and did not mean to come back. What was Gollum talking about? What useful thing could he keep out on the dark lake? But he was wrong. Gollum did mean to come back. He was angry and now hungry. And he was a miserable, wicked creature, and he already had a plan. Not far away was his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing. And there, in his hiding place, he kept a few wretched oddments, and one very beautiful thing. Very beautiful. Very wonderful. He had a ring, a golden ring, a precious ring.
"My birthday present," he whispered to himself,
as he had often done in the endless dark days.
"That's what we wants now, yes. We wants it."
He wanted it because it was a ring of power. And if you slipped on that ring on your finger, you were invisible. Only in the full sunlight could you be seen, and then only by your shadow. And that would be shaky and faint.
"My birthday present. It came to me on my birthday, my precious."
So he had said to himself, but who knows how Gollum came by that present. Ages ago, in the old days, when such rings were still at large in the world, perhaps even the master who ruled them could not have said. Gollum used to wear it at first, till it tired him, and then he kept it in a pouch next to his skin, till it galled him. And now usually he hid it in a hole in the rock on his island, and was always going back to look at it. And still sometimes he put it on when he could not bear to be parted from it any longer, or when he was very, very hungry and tired of fish. Then he would creep along dark passages looking for stray goblins. He might even venture into places where the torches were lit and made his eyes blink and smart, for he would be safe. Oh yes, quite safe. No one would see him, and no one would notice him, till he had his fingers on their throat. Only a few hours ago he had worn it and caught a small goblin imp. How it squeaked. He still had a bone or two left to gnaw, but he wanted something softer.
"Quite safe, yes," he whispered to himself. "It won't see us, will it, my precious?" "No, it won't see us. And its nasty little sword will be useless. Yes, quite."
What is it? That is what, golly, it took me a while. That is what was in his wicked little mind as he slipped suddenly from Bilbo's side and flapped back to his boat and went off into the dark. Bilbo thought he had heard the last of him. Still, he waited for a while, for he had no idea how to find his way out alone. We're only halfway through this. Goodness gracious. Suddenly, he heard a screech. It was a shiver down his back. Gollum was cursing and wailing away in the gloom, not very far off by the sound of it. He was on this island, scrambling here and there, searching and seeking in vain.
Where is it? Where is it?
Cried Bilbo, heard him crying.
Lost it is, my precious! Lost! Lost! Curse us, and curse us, my precious, is lost.
What's the matter? Bilbo called. What have you lost?
It mustn't ask us, shrieked Gollum. Not its business, no. It's lost.
Well, so am I, cried Bilbo, and I want to get unlost. And I won the game, and you promised, so come along. Come and let me out. Hello, Deathclaw, we're reading. And then go on with your looking. Utterly miserable as Gollum sounded, Bilbo could not find such pity in his heart, and he had a feeling that anything Gollum wanted so much could hardly be something good. Come along, he shouted.
Not yet, precious, Gollum answered. We must search for it. It's lost.
But you never guessed my last question, and you promised, said Bilbo.
Never guessed, said
Gollum. Then suddenly, out of the gloom, came a sharp hiss.
What has it got in its pockets? Tell us that. It must tell first.
As far as Bilbo knew, there was no particular reason why he should not tell. Gollum's mind had jumped to a guess quicker than his. Naturally, for Gollum had brooded for ages on this one thing, and he was always afraid of it being stolen. But Bilbo was annoyed at the delay. After all, he had won the game pretty fairly at a horrible risk. Answers were to be guessed, not given, he said.
But it wasn't a fair question, said Gollum. Not a riddle, precious, no.
Oh well, if it's a matter of ordinary questions. Bilbo replied. Then I asked one first. What have you lost? Tell me that.
What has it got in its pockets?
The sound came hissing louder and sharper, and as he looked towards it, to his alarm, Bilbo now saw two small points of light peering at him. As suspicion grew in Gollum's mind. The light of his eyes burned with a small flame. What have you lost? Bilbo persisted. But now the light in Gollum's eye had become a green fire, and it was coming swiftly nearer. Gollum was in his boat again, paddling wildly back to the dark shore, and such a rage of loss and suspicion was in his heart that no sword had any more terror for him. Bilbo could not guess what had maddened the wretched creature, but he saw that all was up, and that Gollum meant to murder him at any rate. Just in time, he turned and ran blindly back up to the dark passage down which he had come, keeping close to the wall and feeling it with his left hand.
What has it got in its pockets?
He heard the loud hiss behind him, and the splash as Gollum leapt from his boat. What have I wonder? He said to himself as he panted and stumbled along. He put his left hand in his pocket. The ring felt very cold as it quietly slipped onto his groping forefinger. The hiss was close behind him. He turned now and saw Gollum's eyes like small green lamps coming up the slope. Terrified, he tried to run faster, but suddenly he struck his toes on a snag on the floor and fell flat with his little sword under him. What? In a moment, Gollum was on him. But before Bilbo could do anything, recover his breath, pick himself up, or wave his sword, Gollum passed by, taking no notice of him, cursing and whispering as he ran. What could it mean? Gollum could see in the dark. Bilbo could see the light of his eyes palely shining, even from behind. Painfully, he got up and sheathed his sword. which was now glowing faintly again. Then, very cautiously, he followed. There seemed nothing else to do. It was a good crawling back down to Gollum's water. Perhaps if he followed him, Gollum might lead him to some way of escape without meaning to.
Curse it! Curse it! Curse it!
Hissed Gollum.
Curse the Baggins! It's gone! What has it got in its pockets? Oh, we guess, my precious. He's found it, yes, he must have. My birthday present.
Bilbo pricked up his ears. He was at last beginning to guess himself. He hurried a little, getting as close as he dared behind Gollum, who was still going quickly, not looking back, but turning his head from side to side, as Bilbo could see the faint glimmer on the walls.
My birthday present, curse it! How did we lose it? My precious. Yes, that's it. When we came this way last, when we twisted the nasty young squeaker, that's it. Curse it. It slipped from us. All of these ages and ages, it's gone.
Suddenly, Gollum sat down and began to weep, a whistling and gurgling sound horrible to listen to. Bilbo halted and flattened himself against the tunnel wall. After a while, Gollum stopped weeping and began to talk. He seemed to be having an argument with himself.
It's no good going back there to search, no. We doesn't remember the places we visited, and now it's no use. The Baggins has got it in its pockets. The nasty noser has found it, we says. We guesses, precious, only guesses. We can't know till we find the nasty creature and squeezes it. But it doesn't know what the present can do, does it? It'll just keep in its pockets. It doesn't know, and it can't go far. It's lost itself, the nasty nosy thing. It doesn't know the way out. It says so. It says so, yes, but it's tricksy. It doesn't say what it means. It won't say what it's got in its pockets. It knows. It knows a way in. It must know a way out, yes. It's off to the back door. To the back door, that's it. The goblins will catch them. It can't get out that way, precious. Goblins, yes. But if it's got the present, a precious present, then goblins will get it, Gollum. They'll find it. They'll find out what it does. We shan't ever be safe again. Never. One of the goblins will put it on, and no one will seize him. He'll be there, but not seen. Not even our clever eyes will notice him. And he'll come creepsy and tricksy and catch us. Then let's stop talking, precious, and make haste. If the Baggins is gone that way, we must go quick and see. Go. Not far now. Make haste.
Whew. A lot of talking right there. Whew. With a spring, Gollum got up and started shambling off at a great pace. Bilbo hurried after him, still cautiously, though his chief fears now was tripping on another snag and falling with a noise. His head was in a whirl of hope and wonder. It seemed that the ring he had was a magic ring. It made you invisible. He had heard of such things, of course, in old tales, but it was hard to believe that he had found one by accident. Still, there it was. Gollum, with his bright eyes, had passed him by, only a yard to one side. Yard? Ooh, JR, using the Imperial system in your book, sir. On they went, Gollum flip-flapping ahead, hissing and cursing. Bilbo behind, going as softly as a hobbit can. Soon they came to places where, as Bilbo had noticed on the way down, side passages opened. This way and that, Gollum began once to count them. 1 left, yes. 1 right, yes. 2 right, yes, yes. 2 left, yes, yes. And so on, and so on. As the count grew and he slowed down, he began to get shaky and weepy, for he was leaving the water further and further behind, and he was getting afraid. Goblins might be about, and he had lost his ring. At last he stopped by a low opening on their left as they went up. 7 right, yes. 6 left, yes,
he whispered. "This is it. This is the way back to the back door. Yes, here's the passage."
He peered in and shrank back.
"But we durst go in there, precious. No, we durst. Goblins is back down there. Lots of goblins is. We smell them. What shall we do? Curse them and crush them? We must wait here, precious. Wait a bit and see."
So they came to a dead stop, and Gollum had brought Bilbo to the way out after all. But Bilbo could not get in. There was Gollum sitting humped up right in the opening, and his eyes gleamed cold in his head as he swayed it from side to side between his knees. Bilbo crept away from the wall more quietly than a mouse, but Gollum stiffened at once and sniffed, and his eyes went green. He hissed softly but menacingly. He could not see the Hobbit, but now he was on the alert, and he had other senses that the darkness had sharpened, hearing and smell. He seemed to be crouched right down with his hands splayed on the floor and his head thrust out, nose almost to the stone. Though he was only a black shadow in the gleam of his own eyes, Bilbo could see or feel that he was tense as a bowstring gathered for a spring. Bilbo almost stopped breathing and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away out of the horrible darkness while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing and put its eyes out. Kill it. It meant to kill him. No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him, or tried to yet, and he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden understanding, a pity mixed with horror, welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless unmarked days without light or hope or of betterment. Hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All these thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled, and then, quite suddenly, in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leaped. No great leap for a man, but a leap in the dark. Straight over Gollum's head he jumped, 7 feet forward and 3 in the air. Indeed, he had known it. He had only just missed the cracking his skull on the low arch of the passage. Gollum threw himself backwards and grabbed as the hobbit flew over him, but too late. His hand snapped on thin air, and Bilbo, falling fair onto his sturdy feet, sped off down the new tunnel. He did not see what Gollum was doing. There was a hissing and a cursing almost at his heels, and at first. Then it stopped. All at once there came a blood-curdling shriek, filled with hatred and despair. Gollum was defeated. He dared go no further. He had lost his prey, and lost too. The only thing he had ever cared for, his precious. The cry brought Bilbo's heart to his mouth, but still he held on. Now faint as an echo, but menacing, the voice behind came. The voice came behind him. "Thief! Thief! Thief! Baggins! We hates it! We hates it! We hates it forever!" Then there was a silence. But that, too, seemed menacing to Bilbo. If goblins are so near that he smelt them, he thought, then they'll have heard his shrieking and cursing. Careful now, or this way will lead you to worse things. Just checking. The passage was low and roughly made. It was not too difficult for the hobbit, except when, in spite of all care, he stubbed his poor toes again, several times, on nasty jagged stones on the floor. A bit low for goblins, at least for the big ones, thought Bilbo, not knowing that even the big ones, the orcs of the mountains, go along at a great speed, stooping low with their hands almost on the ground. Soon the passage that had been sloping down began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply. That slowed Bilbo down. But at last the slope stopped. The passage turned a corner and dipped down again, and there, at the bottom of a short incline, he saw, filtering around another corner, a glimpse of light. Not red light, as of fire or lantern, but a pale, out-of-doors sort of light. Then Bilbo began to run. Scuttling as fast as his legs would carry him, he turned the last corner and came suddenly right into an open space, where the light, after all the time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright. Really, it was only a leak of sunshine, in through a doorway, where a great door, a stone door, was left standing open. Bilbo blinked, and then suddenly he saw the goblins. Goblins in full armor with drawn swords sitting just inside the door and watching it with wide eyes and watching the passage that led to it. They were aroused, alert, ready for anything. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him. Whether it was an accident or a last trick of the ring before it took a new master, it was not on his finger. With yells of delight, the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like an echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo, and forgetting even to draw his sword, he struck his hands into his pockets, and there was the ring still in his left pocket, and it slipped on his finger. The goblins stopped short. They could not see a sign of him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud before, but not so delightedly.
"Where is it?"
they cried.
"Go back up the passage," some shouted.
"This way," some yelled.
"That way,"
others yelled.
"Look out the door,"
bellowed the captain. Whistles blew, armor clashed, swords rattled, goblins cursed and swore, and ran hither and thither, falling over one another and getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry to do and disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but he had the sense to understand what had happened and to sneak behind a big barrel which held drink for the goblin guards, and so get out of the way and avoid being bumped into, trampled to death, or caught by feel. "I must go to the door! I must go to the door!" he kept on saying to himself, but it was a long time before he ventured to try. Then it was like a horrible game of blind man's buff. The place was full of goblins running about, and the poor little hobbit dodged this way and that, was knocked over by a goblin who could not make out what he had bumped into, scrambled again on all fours, slipped between the legs of the captain just in time, got up and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed it nearly to. Bilbo struggled, but he could not move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed, and he stuck. It was awful. His buttons had got wedged on the edge of the door in the doorpost. He could see outside into the open air. There were a few steps running down into a narrow valley between the tall mountains. The sun came out from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door, but he could not get through. Suddenly, one of the goblins inside shouted,
"There's a shadow by the door! Something is outside!"
Bilbo's heart jumped into his mouth. He gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through with a torn coat and waistcoat, leaping down the steps like a goat, while bewildered goblins were picking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course, they came soon down after him, hooting and howling, and thus hunting among the trees. But they don't like the sun. It makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy. They could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of the shadow of the trees, running quick and quiet and keeping out of the sun. So soon they went back grumbling and cursing to guard the door. Bilbo had escaped. End of chapter 5.